I wish I could stop being disappointed in people.
Hi, I'm May. Come make some musical electronics with me.
Let's get intellectual. Hey everybody, welcome back to the PsychedelicCherry. I'm May, as always. It's been a hell of a year, but particularly this weekend has just been the cherry on top of the shit Sunday that is 2020 for me. Burger Records is at the center of a massive sexual assault scandal. A massive number of bands have been accused over the weekend of sexual assault in various degrees, leading all the way to rape. It's worth noting that some of these bands are either not currently or never were burger bands, but nevertheless, such a large number of these bands are on Burger Records that unfortunately Burger is going to bear the brunt of this scandal. Now, I myself am a sort of Burger adjacent artist, as I've been on compilations with Burger and I've played Burger events, though my band has never officially released a record through Burger. But as I was in my early 20s when Burger was first created, a lot of the bands I shared spaces with and kind of came up with became early Burger bands. I do know Lee personally, and I know a lot of the band members who are being accused. Burger Records is based in Orange County, which was my original stomping grounds, and unfortunately it is really hitting pretty close to home this time. I am truly ashamed to admit that some of the accused have been my friends, and they're people I care about and have played shows with and partied with and spent time with and forged friendships with. And so it comes as a bit of a shock to see some of the names on the current list that's out there. But as an abuse survivor myself, of course, my heart breaks most, first and foremost, for the victims. And I just thought this was a really important topic to address firsthand, since a lot of you know that this is the community that I'm a part of. So I hope everyone involved in this scandal takes a very long pause to look and reflect, listen to the victims, look within yourselves. There are a lot of lessons to learn here. Now, before I get into the list of the accused, I think I want to share a little bit of my experience with this subject, because unfortunately, but not coincidentally, my story greatly echoes many of the victims who are coming out right now. And I think there is something to be said about helping each other understand this issue further by sharing what has happened. When I was 16 years old, I was in a band. We were 3 girls. We didn't know what we were doing at all, but we knew that we needed more friends in the community. And when we weren't playing a show, we were attending shows. Pretty much every night, it was just what we did with our time. And at 16 years old, there was no Burger Records yet. Burger started when I was in my early 20s. So there were also not a lot of great venues in Orange County at the time, and there were really only a couple that were all ages. So we frequented certain venues a lot. And it didn't really matter who was on the bill. And I remember one night the 3 of us went to a show at an all ages venue. Didn't particularly care for the bands. It was like that new wave ska thing that is just It's a thing. It's a thing that happened in the early 2000s. Anyhow, we stayed to hang out anyway, and after the show, I caught one of my bandmates was speaking to members of one of the bands that had performed. I think they were the headliners that night. And as I joined the conversation and hung around a bit, we had a plan to hit Denny's before home. So I mentioned that, and soon enough, this group of boys, men, grown men, had invited themselves along. We went to Denny's, and soon enough, a 23-year-old, a 26-year-old, and an 18-year-old from this other band were sitting with us at a table, and one of them was putting his hand on my thigh underneath the table. Now, I had never even been kissed at this point. I really was very focused on art and things like that, family issues, and I didn't really dip into the dating pool in high school. I was pretty virginal when it came to that sort of thing, and I had no idea what to do. I also knew that most people considered me outspoken, someone who's stubborn and willful, and would never believe that I was afraid to put a stop to something like this. But I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. So I just let it happen. And then they invited themselves back to my home. And with my mother asleep upstairs, I brought these men back to my home. And I kind of toured them around the house and put some movie on, Wayne's World or something. And then while walking through my kitchen into another room that should have been empty, it was completely dark, I was grabbed by a man in this band who I guess was waiting there around a corner for me. He shoved me against a wall. He put his face on my mouth. He put his hands on parts of my body that had never been touched by another person before. And I was extremely uncomfortable. I did find the strength and the awkward resolve to kind of back away at some point. And I immediately said, I think you guys should go. I ran upstairs to grab my missing band member, opened a door, and found the 23-year-old man in intimate tangles with my 16-year-old bassist. I told them everyone's leaving, and when I came downstairs, I gathered my bandmates in one car, told them they could follow us, and I'd guide them back to the freeway. When I got in my car, I found out that to add insult to injury, the man who had assaulted me and given me my first highly unwanted kiss and grope session had immediately started making out with my drummer the minute I left his site. So that was my first experience with sexual aggression and sexual assault, but it would not be my last. I was assaulted 2 other times by friends or people I believed were my friends. People who still are looked at, we have mutual friends, and they still look at them as good men. When I was 18, my friend got an apartment. He threw a party. A group of us were there. We all decided we drank, so we shouldn't drive. We all crashed. I fell asleep on a couch by myself and woke up to him groping my breasts. And again, I was so stunned that I grunted and rolled over on my side, which knocked him off of me, and I pretended to go back to sleep. My third assault was a similar situation, a little earlier in my 20s, or a little later in my 20s. I was at a friend's apartment. We all had enough to drink that we shouldn't drive. We all decided to crash on the floor, the couch, etc. One of the people who rented that apartment, I considered a friend. He had his own room. He went to bed in it. But I was woken up later that evening with his hand down my pants. I said no at least 3 times. I can remember those 3 times. He did not stop. And at this point, everything I thought I knew about this man went out the window. I am now terrified. I don't know the parameters to this man's behavior anymore. So now I'm afraid, is this going to become violent? I also realized that I have a lot of other friends who are asleep right next to me on the floor, right next to me on the couch, and I'm starting to feel shame, like somehow this is my doing. So the only solution that I could come up with in the moment was to grab this man's hand, stand up and lead him back into his bedroom as though I were just going to go ahead and do what he wanted me to do. And luckily, his level of intoxication ultimately ended up saving me from any further assault that night. The reason I bring this up is because I think men really think that it would be very obvious that they were raping someone because you'd be holding down this woman as she screams and fights. And unfortunately, the dichotomy is a little different than that. It's a little more nuanced than that. A lot of women would rather just give up than risk violence because it's so obvious that brutality would not be favorable to them. So that's my experience, and it echoes. I'm not going to go into great detail about a lot of the victims who are coming forward with these band members, but they are very similar to these stories, and most of them are underaged, and most of them were fans. Now, how did this Burger Records garage band scene spiral begin? As far as I can tell, it looks like it began with Cherry Glazer's lead singer Clementine Creevy writing a statement piece that I believe she released on Twitter, expressing that her band's first bassist was actually statutorily raping her consistently, that she was in a abusive relationship with him when she was 15, 16 and he was in his 20s, and that it took her many years to realize what was happening. And he went on to abuse other women. Predominantly a very notable woman in this garage rock community is Melissa Brooks, singer of Aquadolls. So she came out to tell her story about the abuse as well. And I should note that this bassist then started his own band, the Buttertones, which was nominally successful, though not a burger band. And I believe it's these two women who really inspired a lot of the women to come forward and tell their story about abuses that happened to them. And unfortunately, that brings us to the gory detail of the back room. So the back room is a room that exists at Burger Records' physical location, their shop in Fullerton. And it's, you know, just like a storage room. But in the beginning of Burger Records' creation, Burger and Lee, the two founders of the record label, could not afford rent at an apartment. So I believe Sean was the first to live there, and then Lee took it over. And since then, they've been renting it out to perhaps not so savory individuals. Now, unfortunately, the shop itself, the front room, was a very common home to all-age shows. And the back room was notoriously accessible. I have been in the back room. I have never witnessed abuse, but I have witnessed, you know, blunts and beers being passed, the traditional expected backroom behavior. But there are beds back there. There are futons and things. And it is my understanding that There are many young girls coming forward to say that band members of bands that they were huge fans of lured them into that back room and then performed sexually abusive behaviors on these girls. So, unfortunately, it doesn't look good for Berger. Now, can Berger survive this? I don't know. I think probably the more important question is, were they complicit? You know, it's caused me a lot of thought, because I've always liked Sean and Lee, and thought their hearts were in the right place. Just two guys who really want young kids to have something that they didn't have. But it does kind of bring to mind, you know, if I were walking through Michael Jackson's house and I came across the child's playroom and I thought, I'm sure it's fine, you'd take a second look, wouldn't you? And there is something to the idea that if you're going to host all-age shows, having this back room with beds and unsavory characters housing themselves back there, well, it leads one to think it's a difficult thing to at least not raise an eyebrow to. And that's really unfortunate, because that back room was not set up as some horrendic pedophilic den, haven for the scoundrels of the world. The back room was just the back room, and the idea that it was turned into this horrendous trauma room where arrogant asshole men with too much time on their hands and too many drugs in their system would take advantage of 16-year-old girls, well, that's frankly disgusting. It's tough. I don't know that Sean or Lee, you know, I don't know what their level of willful ignorance was. And it has since come forward that Lee has accusations of his own, and boy, it's a mess. It sometimes leaves me asking myself, what causes this? And I think, you know, there's always that notion of power. Boys who maybe didn't hold the power in high school, and now suddenly this massive indie label that has such clout within this very specific genre-based community, it kind of was, you know, a scratching post for the cool of the cool in garage. And this record label has branded you. They've said, you're one of us, and now you have power that you can exert over others. And unfortunately, I think some young men who didn't have very great self-awareness or perhaps control over their impulses took that arrogance and that privilege of power and abused it. I also think that there is another element in this community, which is that we're all participating in a nostalgic delusion a little bit. We all make a type of music that most people don't care about anymore. We make music that is reflective of the 60s, the mid-century, the 50s, 60s, 70s, even sometimes 80s. And when you're doing something so antiquated with such nostalgic regard for what used to be, I think there is a pitfall of lending so much mystique to an idea of what it means to be rock and roll, to live a certain life, creates very, very flexible parameters. It creates an unhealthy idolization of a dirtbag lifestyle. And when that becomes your fantasy that you are trying desperately to realize, it's very easy to just descend into complete and utter human garbage, which many have done. And unfortunately, I think that that is something we need to work very hard to fight against, because the glamour of rock and roll, particularly if you're not a lover of mainstream culture, is very alluring and appealing. But that era was cruel to many people, and we cannot idolize those ideals. So the third thing I want to address is this happened because we allowed it to happen. There were certainly people who saw these girls being treated this way. There were certainly bandmates who were told trophy stories by the abusers the next day. There were certainly likely to be record label owners hearing stories. We have to be on guard a little more. We have to love each other enough to look out for one another. And that can exist in a garage rock paradigm. It has to if we're going to move forward. Otherwise, we lose it all. Okay, so this was a very serious episode of the PsychedelicCherry, but it's been a while, and I frankly have been overwhelmed by this. So it's just like 2020 is the gift that keeps on giving. Anyhow, I'm gonna go ahead and close this by listing off the absolutely daunting list of offenders. I should note here that I don't believe anyone in this list has been legally charged with a crime. My heart goes out to the victims. The list is as followed: the Buttertones, the Growlers, Part-Time, Love Cop, Swimmers, the Frights, the Orwells, Pity Party, Together Pangea, Cosmonauts, Gabrielle Pacheco, Santoros, Gap Dream, No Parents, Bane's World, Inner Wave, Cuco. I will do my best to update in the comments as more accusations come in, and if I hear anything between now and editing, I will hop on my Samsung and edit in a little update. But my heart goes out to you, and please, everyone, critical thinking, think with kindness, think with logic. Seacrest out.